Hey everyone, it's JJ. Of course, who else would it be? But it's JJ. It's 4th of July week, and this is usually the time of year a lot of you start coming back and getting into fantasy football again, which is great. For people hopping back in, hopefully you're able to listen back to an off-season's worth of episodes and catch up on what's going on in fantasy football right now. If not, no big deal. You got plenty of time. There are plenty of things to help. Whether it's this podcast feed or the late round draft guide, which you can purchase right now over on lateround.com, those will all help. And this episode should help too. I went back and picked out 5 mailbag questions from this offseason to feature on this mailbag rewind. So if you've been around, you've heard these answers before. But it's a good sort of recap of my process and how I'm thinking about this stuff at a higher level. At least I think. Anyway, I hope you dig it. Hope you had a great 4th of July holiday. And I'm excited to get back to it early next week with a brand new episode. The first question is from @Mikey'd. It says, where would you have ranked Jaxon Smith-Njigba among wide receivers if he was able to come out last year? I feel like I've been in this JSN bubble for the last week and a half of my life and I just can't get out. I can't escape. But I still have more to say about him because I keep seeing more and more takes about him. As I've said in the past, draft capital is part of my wide receiver model. Meaning if a player ends up going higher in the draft than expected, his prospect score is going to change. It's going to get better. And then the reverse is true too. Right now, JSN is projected to go 20th overall on NFLMockDraftDatabase.com, and that places him in the 96th percentile in my prospect model. Last season, Drake London, Chris Olave, and Garrett Wilson had better prospect scores than that. Treylon Burks and Jamison Williams and Jahan Dotson did not. Now, how he would have ranked if he was in that class, I don't know, because this past year did hurt his draft stock more than likely. And each draft is unique with different team needs and such. So I could just comment on how my model views all of this. And it views London, Olave, and Wilson as better prospects than Jaxon Smith-Njigba. Not by a ton, but they're better. I feel like this has made me some JSN hater. At the end of the day, he's going to be my wide receiver 1 in this class, more than likely. I think he's got an extremely good profile, and he's more than likely someone I'm going to be drafting this year. I just have seen this taken way too far. At least in my opinion. JSN is not a Jamar Chase prospect. He doesn't have projected draft capital in the top 10, which is really important. I sent a newsletter out last week to subscribers talking about this, and I talked about it when comparing Drake London to JSN on last week's mailbag episode. Draft capital matters. There's an inherent evaluation with draft capital. So if JSN does go 20th overall, strictly looking at draft capital, his odds of being elite aren't nearly as good as someone who was drafted in the top 10, if you're only looking at draft capital. So given that we know that he's not a Jamar Chase level prospect, or it appears that way right now, I can't understand the way people are viewing the 102 in rookie drafts right now. I actually continued this conversation about JSN, and I sent another newsletter on Wednesday about it. That one was a little bit more ranty and more qualitative. But there was a tweet from @McNamara Dynasty, who's a really strong follow on Twitter, by the way. And the tweet was referencing a dynasty trade. It asked, which side would you prefer? Chris Olave, Kenneth Walker, and the 111, or A.J. Brown, Elijah Moore, and the 102. And this is a single quarterback league. That's very important. Now, I have a preference for what side I would take here, but I don't think it's like a bad trade or anything. What really got me going with this, because I'm such a nerd about this stuff, was how people were commenting saying that the best 2 assets in that trade were on the A.J. Brown side. In other words, A.J. Brown and the 102 were the 2 best parts of that deal. And I'm just baffled. I don't understand. You're telling me that you would trade Chris Olave for the 102? I mean, you could argue that you shouldn't be trading Kenneth Walker for the 102. I'm lower on Kenneth Walker, so I can understand that a little bit more, but Chris Olave? And yes, some people responded and said that they would trade Chris Olave for the 102, specifically because they think that Jaxon Smith-Njigba is a better prospect than Chris Olave was. And this is where I want to talk a little game theory and logic, and how I think about this stuff, because I think it's important to peel back that layer. It is 100% cool and fine and understandable if you think that Jaxon Smith-Njigba is a better prospect this year than Chris Olave was last year. There's like a 1 to 2 percentile difference in my model. It's not like I see things so drastically different. This isn't like Jahan Dotson or Sky Moore versus Chris Olave. So you might hear that and you might think, okay, then why is this such a big deal if we like JSN more than Chris Olave straight up right now? If we like JSN more as a prospect, why not trade for him? And the answer is because we've seen Chris Olave dominate in the NFL. Among 50-plus target rookie wide receivers since 2011, Olave's yards per route run rate was 5th best. His targets per route run was 4th best. His target share per game rate was also 5th best. His yards per team pass attempt was 6th best. Even if you don't care about those peripheral numbers, despite them being predictive, he was still top 20 in PPR points per game among all rookie wide receivers since 2011. Olave had an amazingly good rookie season, and it's been amazingly undervalued. Just look at the way that people viewed Garrett Wilson this past year versus Chris Olave. Garrett Wilson won Rookie of the Year, and he deserved to. He balled out. He's great. But his numbers weren't any different than Chris Olave's. In fact, on a per-game basis, on a per-target basis, on a per-reception basis, Chris Olave looked better. You can't just ignore what Chris Olave did as a rookie. Data points in the NFL are so much more valuable than data points from college. It's why if you look at my year 2 model, it's far more accurate in predicting future success than the prospect model is. And of course it is. The NFL is different. Some players dominate in college, but they don't dominate in the NFL. When you have actual evidence of a player doing well at the NFL level at a young age as a rookie, you have to weigh that heavily. Like, think of it this way. What's more predictive of future fantasy football success in the NFL? Chris Olave's incredibly good rookie season in the NFL, or Jaxon Smith-Njigba's great sophomore season in college? I think we all know the answer to that. And as all of you know, I think about this stuff in a non-black and white way. Of course, there's a possibility that JSN is better than Chris Olave. What if he ends up being the best wide receiver of all time? You have to assign some sort of probability to those types of outcomes. What's possible isn't necessarily probable. It's more probable for JSN to have that high of a ceiling than some random wide receiver in this class, yeah. But it's also more probable for Chris Olave to get to that upside, given what we saw from him as a rookie. And how that's aligned with other stud wide receivers in fantasy football. I said this in my email blast earlier this week, but there's a scene from Family Guy where Peter and Lois Griffin are given this opportunity to get a boat. But then they're interrupted by the choice to take a mystery box instead. So they could either have a boat or they could have the mystery box. And there's a very famous quote from Peter that gets thrown out there all the time where he says, "A boat's a boat, but the mystery box could be anything. It could even be a boat." I'm all about chasing upside and gobbling up rookie picks to build value on my dynasty roster. I've talked about that at length the last couple of years on this show. But why are we ignoring the potential upside of Chris Olave himself, who flashed that upside as a rookie? To me, it feels like if you're going to trade Chris Olave for the 102, you're taking the mystery box on the chance that you could get a boat. Could you explain why your prospect in year 2 models generally don't account for things like injury or bad quarterback play? So this is an important question, and it's one that I touch on in the prospect guide. But even if you're not reading the guide, which is totally fine, I think the answer here still might be helpful. The first thing to keep in mind with my prospect model and my year 2 model is that they're meant as a guide more than anything else. To me, they're there to keep you in check. There's no reason you need to feel some strong conviction when a player has a 92nd percentile score versus a 91st percentile score. The model sees one player as better than the other, but the model also isn't going to be perfect. If you like that 91st percentile player more, have at it. If it's a 92nd percentile guy versus a 75th percentile one, yeah, maybe you should think twice. That's what I mean by the model keeping you in check and being a guide. So what that means is that you can inject your own subjectivity into things. I wouldn't inject that subjectivity when scores are dramatically different. But if you notice something about a player's profile that the model might miss, go for it. The issue is that we can often overstate what those things are. Like you're asking why the models don't account for injury or bad quarterback play. Well, how are you defining that? Why should you assume that a player not getting hurt would have meant he performs really well? Or why assume that quarterback play was the result of the poor production that a player had? This question seems more geared towards wide receivers, so I'll answer with that in mind. The prospect model uses some per game numbers, but the biggest production-related metric in the model is yards per team pass attempt, and that metric is looking at a player's best season. And it's not a prorated number or a per-game number. It's the raw receiving yards a player had divided by his team's total pass attempts. So clearly, if a player got hurt, he'll look worse in a given season within that statistic. The numerator is going to be a lot smaller. So how is that fair? Well, with questions like this, you have to ask yourself about the alternative. In this case, the alternative is, should I use some sort of games cutoff for yards per team pass attempt? Or should I use per game yards per team pass attempt numbers? You can start to come up with different iterations of the metric then. And I did that. I tested that. And within the model that I'm working with, the raw number worked best. Or I should at least say there wasn't any significant difference in using another method. And you might say, how is that possible? Well, a few things. Number one, production is just one of the many inputs in the model. A player dropping in yards per team pass attempt doesn't make him irrelevant. Look at Drake London last year. Drake London was my wide receiver 1 in the model. And Drake London was hurt throughout college. His yards per team pass attempt number was not very good. Number two, though, you can still run into issues doing this a different way. For example, if you did a per game yards per team pass attempt number, which is totally fine to do for the record, but if you did it per game, you run into sample size problems for players who didn't play a full season. A player who played 6 games could have a really good number there. But because it's across so few games, it's not necessarily indicative of the type of player that he is, the type of receiver that he is. Nothing's going to be perfect, but that's a good reason why across a large sample, there's not a meaningful difference within this model when looking at raw numbers versus per game ones. And then obviously when speaking about quarterback play, you have to remember that both models are utilizing market share statistics, which means a player is being compared to his teammates within those statistics. Which means those guys are playing under the same circumstances. They're playing with the same quarterback. Now, I will say the year 2 model, it's a little bit different with this. Because something like yards per route run is in that model. And that can be influenced by better quarterback play. But we have to remember that if there's an exception to the rule, it doesn't mean the rule is invalid. We can sit here and say, look at this wide receiver who missed games as a rookie who ended up doing well. But that isn't happening nearly as much as you'd probably think. For example, if we focus on the wide receivers who are in my prospect database, so guys who would have a year 2 model score in the first place, a whole lot of them played fewer than half of their games as rookies. So fewer than 8 games. I'm talking like 350, 400 players here. Because a lot of guys are undrafted and just couldn't find the field in year 1. Guess how many of those players, all of those players, gave us a single season above 13 PPR points per game in either year 2 or year 3. One of them. One. And it was Allen Hurns, a guy my model wasn't going to really pick up on anyway. We have to remember that the year 2 model is trying to predict what's going to happen in year 2 and year 3 of a player's career. So when a player gets off to a slow start, if he misses games, it's going to be harder for him to capitalize in the second or third year. And that's why Jameson Williams, while he can absolutely hit because his prospect score was great, we have to be level-headed about a situation, in my opinion, of course. Every once in a while, we're going to have a situation like Travis Etienne. But even then, since he plays the running back position, I told people to just ignore what happened in year 1. He was a player to target in my draft guide. So we can use subjectivity to help us out with these very rare instances. But mathematically, the reason we don't need to overdo it just for these types of players is because, number one, those types of players who miss an entire season don't exist in large numbers. But then number two, there actually might be reason to fade those players within the context of looking at year 2 and year 3. We don't see hits from those guys very often at all. So you'd then be changing a model for the sake of just a handful of guys. And to me, that doesn't make that much sense to do. What impact will Charbonnet's draft have on Seattle's backfield, particularly Kenneth Walker? One of the top topics this week in fantasy circles has been the Zach Charbonnet pick and what it all means for Kenneth Walker. I talked about the pick itself on Monday's episode, giving reason as to why the Seahawks made that pick. I really think it comes down to two things. The first being that Kenneth Walker had the worst success rate among 100-plus attempt running backs last season, and his rate of gaining positive yardage per rush was also worst in the league. He was a home run hitting running back. So they paired him with Charbonnet, who was good at picking up tough yards without that same type of big playability. But there's also pass catching, which I think is just as important. Kenneth Walker was not a good pass catcher in college. You guys got sick of me bringing that up last year. His 5.4% best season reception share was really, really low, and his yards per route run in college never exceeded 0.77 in a single season. Charbonnet's, meanwhile, was never below that mark, and during the two players' final seasons, Charbonnet had basically triple the yards per route run compared to Walker. And then all the while, Charbonnet had more than double Walker's best season reception share. And this is all coming after a season where Walker didn't do that much as a pass catcher. He ranked low in PFF's receiving grade among running backs. He was one of the worst in the league per route run. And he averaged about a 7.5% target share per game when he took over that backfield. That's nothing special. I think it would be silly for anyone to defend Kenneth Walker, the receiver, the pass catcher. Defending Walker, the rusher, that makes a lot more sense. He can be electric with the ball in his hands. He was the best pure runner in last year's class. But the Charbonnet pick hurts him. Not because that early down work is just going to vanish, but because the receiving ceiling is now going to be tougher to achieve. I think there's at least some chance that Charbonnet becomes a favorite for that coaching staff if he ends up hitting, if he ends up being a good player. But I want to be clear here. Just because I'm explaining why the Seahawks may have made the Charbonnet pick, it doesn't mean I think he's going to outperform Kenneth Walker in fantasy football. I still think that Kenneth Walker's the favorite there. My point is more so there are a lot of people out there who seem to think that this is not that big of a deal. That it's a deal, but it's not a big one. That's where I disagree. Before that pick, Walker had hope to be an every down back. Now, I've had him as a sell all offseason, but I still recognized that it could go in that direction. With the Charbonnet investment, those odds have dropped considerably. He's going to need Charbonnet to bust as a player in order to maintain that value or get hurt. My early projections see Walker as more of a low-end RB2 with upside. That's for 2023. That's off of a 52% rush share in that offense and about a 5% target share. Maybe you feel more optimistic than those numbers. But I think the numbers are logical when you figure the player that they just drafted and the investment they made to get him. And yeah, it's the Seahawks. They love their running backs and they value the position more than the rest of the league. But it's not like Charbonnet himself is a bad running back. He was projected to go in round 2, maybe early round 3. And I will say this, the backfield's a little bit different in best ball leagues where you won't have to worry about how things will go down each week. But I did want to at least get this out there because it was easy to take what I said on Monday and think that I just like Charbonnet more. Kenneth Walker is still projected to be the better fantasy asset. But I do think I'll be lower than consensus on Walker. But that hasn't really changed. I've been lower on Walker than the consensus. And I do think that Charbonnet is at least somewhat of a threat to be the 1A in that offense down the line. He's a good running back who does things that Walker doesn't do. And that, in turn, limits Walker's ceiling. This next question is from Brandon on Patreon. It says, how do you go about projecting a player like Calvin Ridley who missed significant non-injury related time and is also on a new team? You cross your fingers and you hope for the best. In all seriousness, though, projections are not an exact science. There's a lot of subjectivity that goes into them. I've done shows in the past on the process of building projections. I think the most recent was episode 373 with Rich Rebar. That was back in 2020. But we're making educated guesses when we're building them. I mean, maybe educated guessing isn't the right way to phrase it. If you have a projection system and it's thoughtful and it works off of the right things, that's going to be better than someone building projections manually. Like with my projections, I start at the team level and I work my way down to the quarterback level, and then I get to divvying things up between running back, wide receiver, and tight end. And to get the team level numbers, I've got some regression related formulas that I use. To help with quarterback numbers, it's the same thing. And then the big thing to figure out with the skill position guys is market share statistics. Target share and backfield share. That's what drives a player's projection most because volume drives production. So some players are easier to project than others. We have a pretty good idea of the type of target share and efficiency a player like Justin Jefferson is going to see this year. His touchdown total might fluctuate a little bit because that's less stable, but from a volume perspective, he's been in the 28 to 29% target share range in each of his last 2 seasons. projecting him for a 28% target share isn't that much of a stretch. That's what we've seen over the last 2 years. Calvin Ridley's projection is going to have more volatility. And this goes for any player who's in a new environment or who's coming off an injury. You're looking at what they did historically. On the volume front for Calvin Ridley, he saw target share per game rates of 15% and 17% as a first and second year player. And then he blew up in year 3 and he had a 25% rate. He started to see good volume in his 4th year, but he didn't play that much. And then last year he was out. So chances are he's not going to be under a 15% target share, right? We know that's his absolute floor. He did that as a rookie. He's never been below that number during his entire career. He may not get to a 25% share though. When you consider that he's only done that once across an entire season, he hasn't played in like 2 years, and he's on a new team. And then you factor in the competition on said team. So when you play it all out, Ridley's likely in that 21, maybe 22% target share group. And then from there, you can use some regression analysis to figure out his yards per target, which feeds into his total yards, which feeds into his projected touchdowns. So that's a very generalized way of talking about projections. But hopefully it helps a little bit with a player like Calvin Ridley. This next question is from @BulldozerJohn. It says, when you roster one of the backs in an uncertain backfield, e.g. Khalil Herbert, what do you think about trading for all of the backs in said backfield versus more running back diversity on your roster? It seems like at least one of them fits this criteria for me each offseason. So this is something that I've answered before on the podcast, but it's worth repeating. Do not go into your draft with the intent to capture an entire backfield, especially when that backfield is Chicago's. And this is not a best ball take for the record. But the idea of ambiguous backfields is that players' ADPs drop in season-long drafts due to them not having high projected volume. They're splitting a backfield with someone else. So their price drops. But oftentimes, those are the types of running backs who end up emerging and becoming huge values in fantasy football. I have tons of episodes through the years on the topic. So people then come to me and say, well, JJ, then why not just draft every single running back from a particular backfield? That way you can get the one who emerges, the huge value in fantasy football. And the very simple answer to that is not all of these running backs end up emerging. These ambiguous backfields often stay ambiguous. So you can't really do this. And I say especially Chicago's backfield because that means you're going to draft 3 running backs from the same team, just hoping that one emerges. And then you also have to hope that that one player is effective in fantasy football. That his environment is even good enough for him to be a difference maker. And I'm not sure Chicago even has that kind of environment given what Justin Fields is going to do with his legs. Players will emerge from these ambiguous backfields. They do every single year. But capturing the backfield is a bad idea in season-long leagues. You're making the assumption that a player is going to emerge from the single backfield that you targeted. More often than not, the backfield stays ambiguous. So instead, you should target players in these specific backfields who fit certain criteria. That'll increase your chances of hitting on players who end up emerging. And there is data that can help you out with this. I cover it all in the draft guide.